am Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted to have Shaun Star join me from Australia. Shaun is an old friend, but much more than that, Shaun is a very important part of the Australia-India relationship. He was instrumental in building the Australia-India Youth Dialogue, which has become one of the most successful people-to-people engagement between Australia and India. And he didn't stop at that. Shaun proceeded then to join an Indian university, where he created a whole new department for the study of Australia-India relationship, and is about to finish his PhD now. So he'll soon be Dr. Shaun. Shaun Star, thank you very much for joining me.
Here with you today, Hindol.
Tell me, Shaun, look back at your own engagement with India. You lived in India for a long time. You lived in Chittaranjan Park. We call you an honorary Bengali. You grew to love Chittaranjan Park and all the Bengali food there as much as Bengalis themselves. Tell us a little bit about your own experience in India and what actually made you continue this engagement with India, this long-standing love affair, should I say, with India. You had your baby in India, your wife worked in India. What kept this, this engagement, this love affair together?
It depends, Hindol, how long you have to discuss this
Yeah.
story, because I joke with some of my colleagues who I work with at OP General Global University now, which, as you know, is based in Sonipat, that
Yes.
one day I'll write a book called From Sydney to Sonipat. There's just so many rich experiences that all, in some respects, happened by accident from one journey to the next, connected to one another. Because in 2009, if I can rewind, I'd never been to India. In fact, I'd never been to Asia. I'd traveled to Europe extensively through college, through university, but I'd never been to India. All of a sudden, I received an Australian government scholarship or grant, if you will, which has almost spun off into the New Colombo Plan as we see it today, which allowed young Australians to work in and study in parts of Asia. And 20 people in Australia received this scholarship. Only 2 went to India, which I found fascinating. Many went to China, to Hong Kong, Indonesia, Singapore. And I opted for India. I mean, as a budding lawyer, law scholar, I thought, what better place to be? Another common law country, very similar democracies. The language of the law is in English. Second, a growing business partnership with Australia. This was 2010. It was still quite nascent back then. Of course, more recently, we've just signed a free trade agreement and in the process of having a fully fledged free trade agreement later this year. But people were more looking to China then for business. And finally, the cultural elements and the food and the dress and all of
Let's
these
not
unique
forget cricket, Shaun, your great love for cricket. We
that
can
that
see a
was
cricket big bat behind you.
you're
You used
right,
to play
yes.
cricket yourself very well, I should add.
Yeah.
So
I
surely there was the cricket too.
I don't know about very well, but you're right. Cricket it was certainly a connector of people of similar interests, and it's something that I've continued to engage in with my Indian friends as well. But one thing led to another. That scholarship was for 1 year, but so many friendships and professional opportunities, and just by chance, more and more doors opened. And my wife, of course, worked in rural India, working in the education space, in capacity building, connecting schools from Australia and India. And for the longest time, we just, as you said, fell in love with India, embraced our experiences, and one thing led to another. And 1 year turned into 10 years, and 10 years later, we were still living in India. Our son was born in Delhi, and our whole sort of setup was there. And in many respects, things went full circle because of course, I went to India on this Australian government scholarship on you could call it a mobility program. And now, in fact, later this year, in December and January next year, we'll be hosting between 300 and 400 Australian students funded by the Australian government with our Australian university partners in India for 2 to 3 week residential programs to learn about India, to embrace India the same way that I had the opportunity to do what is now 13 years ago. So it's been an exciting journey, and one through the Centre for India Australia Studies at Jindal, and through Australia India Youth Dialogue. uh, I and others have been able to give similar opportunities, hopefully, to the next generation of the Australia India space as well.
Tell us a little bit about the Australia India Youth Dialogue. That's where you and I met. I still remember, we were at I think at a restaurant or a nightclub in Delhi, and we had been introduced, and you turned to me and said, well, you should be part of the Australia India Youth Dialogue, because we got chatting about my work. I used to be a journalist at that time, and I had no idea what the Australia India Youth Dialogue was. And actually, most people at that time in India, in Delhi, had no idea what the Australia India Youth Dialogue was. And you actually did a lot of work in introducing many Indians to what the Australia India Youth Dialogue was. And indeed, that being part of that dialogue became our sort of entry point into getting to know Australia. Getting to love many Australian people, making friends, making connections, building relationships, both in business and in, personal life.
Well, Hindol, always pleasing to hear, and of course, you and I have known each other for many years since that meeting, and since the youth dialogue. But always happy to hear that when people have perhaps very limited engagement with Australia India Youth Dialogue, I'll call it AIYD, or indeed Indians have limited connect to Australia and vice versa, that by bringing young minds, young leaders together in forums like the Australia India Youth Dialogue, that this project is proof, right? People can remain engaged and form deep engagements and professional and personal relationships with young professionals from the other country. I mean, if you in your own journey think back, would you have been this engaged with Australia had that chance meeting not happened, had Australia India Youth Dialogue in Sydney and Melbourne for you that year not happen? Similarly, I can think of, it's now we're getting into, we have 30 young leaders from business, from politics, from government, from sport, from arts, from music, you name it, young people under the age of 40, who are from 15 from Australia, 15 from India each year, meeting on an annual basis, talking about issues that not only affect their own country, but the bilateral relationship and indeed the world. And the relationships, as I said, that have come from this, the projects that have stemmed from this have just been remarkable.
I completely agree. I do not think I would have been this engaged in the bilateral relationship between Australia and India. And in a sense, a champion of the bilateral relationship between Australia and India, had I not gone to that fortuitous trip to Australia, to Sydney and Melbourne, through the AIYD, the Australia India Youth Dialogue. So that entry point helped me make, countless friends, build countless relationships, all of which 10 years later has come to this point. And indeed, the Australia India relationship at a government to government level has also really taken off. Tell us a little bit about, how you took that journey forward into building you were already working as an academic in India. You were doing some work in sports to begin with. How did you channelize all this to really create a whole new department, at the Jindal University in Sonipat?
Oh, look, by that stage, we had already done probably, I'd say, 6 or 7 Australia India youth dialogues, and the time had come in many respects to hand over the baton. Of course, there was a very strong core team alongside me in the early days. We had a very strong vision. Of course, we had a good succession plan, and now there's a new team doing fantastic work with the dialogue. And it was time for me to think how else I could add value to the space, to India, to Australia India relationship, a space that had helped me on my personal and professional growth journey till date. And in 2016, I had a chance meeting actually with the Vice Chancellor of OP General Global University. In fact, at the launch of my book, which was on Australia and India, the legal comparison, if you will, on the lawns, on the High Commissioner's lawns. And I was delighted to have the then Attorney General, George Brandis, launch that alongside a former Attorney General, Shri Soli Sorab, the late Soli Sorabji, who was the first Honorary Order of Australia, actually, first Indian to receive that, the highest honour from the Australian government. At that launch, the Vice Chancellor and I met for the first time, and a series of conversations over the next sort of 6 months led to the vision of a centre being housed in an Indian institution which focuses on the India-Australia bilateral relationship. Prior to this, there had been Australian studies or Australia studies taught in various Indian institutions, perhaps on an ad hoc basis. However, there had been no concerted effort to promote the Australia-India relationship from an Indian institution. There'd been several examples of this in Australia. However, with institutional backing, this was just a phenomenal opportunity. And in 2016, when the then High Commissioner Harinder Sidhu launched it, I was the first Australian in Hindol Global University to be working there at the time. There are now more than 10 Australians, more than 30 people with Australian degrees on faculty. And so many students from Hindol are studying, experiencing mobility programs in Australia, and vice versa, as I alluded to before. Hundreds and hundreds of students every year through our programs are having an immersive, residential, engaging experience about what India really is. And they're beyond the stereotypes, arguably, that they're fed in the media and in popular culture here in Australia. They're actually getting first-hand experience alongside Indian batchmates and colleagues when they are here, and they go back wanting more. Many of them, in fact, want to come back to work, to do internships, to travel and experience India beyond those programs. So that, to us, is what success looks like on the mobility front.
Amazing. Tell us a little bit about the sports work you've done and also the work that you've done as a lawyer. That those are your other avatars, so to speak. And there too, there's an Australia-India overlap in your work. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, look, sport is a great connector of people in many respects. So, we talk so much about people to people links in this relationship, and indeed, I know you're studying the diaspora, and that's a big key part of this project. So many of my conversations, even with taxi drivers, auto wallahs, are about, where are you from? They'll ask me in Hindi, and then I'll say Australia, and they'll fire off half a dozen Australian cricketers' names. So, sport is a great connector. It's also a great leveler. I love playing and participating in sport, and as you alluded to, I've worked in sports, the nexus between sports and the law. So, sports law is was my research specialization. I worked in the Indian Premier League for a company called IMG, who were contracted to run the league for many years until recently. And indeed, a big part of my research is looking at sport governance in India, integrity in sport in India, the huge opportunities for growth and policy reform in sport in India. And there's a lot Australia and India have done and can do with each other in this field of sport administration, sport governance, and all the allied services around sport. So apart from being a keen cricket fan, and apart from, I feel like I was one of only 2 or 3 people in the crowd in Ahmedabad when Australia lost to India in the World Cup in 2011. It was a very loud and long-lasting memory in my mind. But there's so many memories of sport and cricket. I've played cricket alongside Indians and other expatriates in India for many years, of course, socially. But it is an important part of the relationship. But we've moved beyond, of course, just cricket. But I can say I'm very lucky to be able to be working in that space and continue to be working in board roles in sport administration now, and still as a sports law researcher and scholar beyond that.
Tell us a little bit about your future plans in the Australia-India space, Shaun. You're about to you're about to get your PhD and become a doctor, so to speak. We have often maintained among friends that you're an honorary Indian. Certainly, your son, we always claim, is indeed Indian, more than Australian. What are your, what kind of work are you looking to do in the future? And are there any plans that you're going to move your family back to Indian shores?
Well, look, the last thing first, as I've alluded to, things have over the past now 13 years keep happening by chance, and doors open and doors continue to open. So watch this space. I'm very lucky to be in an institution like JGU right now, which houses the Centre for India Australia Studies. So for now, the focus is to build and make sure we have strong quality assurances around our key pillars, one of which is this student mobility space. So creating opportunities for young Indians and young Australians to engage across the Australia-India space is really important. As you and I both know, the young demographic is the future. If you think about the sheer hundreds of millions of people under the age of, let's say, 30, um, at university age, you have not only in India people who are shaping the future of India and people who are shaping the future of the Indo-Pacific region, the region that you and I are both sitting in, but also the world. So focusing on this young demographic, the change makers of the future is critical. And that's why being housed in a university, in a higher education institution, is a really unique opportunity to continue building and scaling these immersive experiences, these abilities to engage and understand and appreciate each other. Because I maintain, in fact, it's probably not a coincidence, but it's quite fitting that you and I are speaking today on the day that Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India, arrived in Sydney, in Australia. The second time he's been here since 2014. And in fact, in 2014, he was the first Prime Minister to come here in 26 years. So it's quite telling that we are getting this traffic both ways of the Prime Ministers. Prime Minister Albanese was just in India 2 months ago. And we are getting this huge signaling at the government level of the importance of the relationship for strategic reasons, for economic reasons. But we're also seeing a growing diaspora. We're seeing a growing demand to grow the people to people links between our countries. And I feel like the student mobility space, getting young people to experience the other country, the other culture, is as critical, if not more critical, than some of the signaling, some of the important agreements that are happening at that top tier government level as well.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the point that you made about getting young people to immerse in a different culture. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how that immersive experience that young people get allow them to really recognize cultures for what they are rather than what they read about in the media. This seems to be particularly important, especially because the questions of what values nations share, whether nations share, nations which cooperate with one another share the same values, to what extent they share the same values. All of those questions are really back in our midst. And therefore, perhaps these immersion programs are particularly important to create a whole new generation of citizenry, even punditry, so to speak, people who go out there and offer opinion tomorrow, to really understand cultures. I wonder what you think about that. How does it impact this value-based engagement, so to speak, by teaching a new generation about the values of another culture?
Hindol, you raise a really good point. And if I'm sitting here where I am currently in Australia, I mean, we're probably better than we are today than we were a decade ago. But anywhere in the world, if you're reading news, if you're engaged in pop culture, or just sitting in another country trying to learn about another country, or just uh, absorbing the content you're fed about another country, you're not going to have the full, truthful, immersive experience. There really is no substitute for going to a country, and this is not just true of India. It's true of any other culture, any other country, and that's what we are seeing when we seek feedback from. Let's use our immersion programs as an example. our young Australian students are fed content or read content, whether it's about Delhi pollution, whether it's about cricket, whether it's about other stereotypes and sometimes negative stereotypes, let's face it. When they come to India, and it's not just the learning, I would argue it's far beyond the learning in the classroom from leaders in the field, from professors, from business people in India saying, this is the amazing stuff that we're doing. These are the challenges we face. We don't deny some of these challenges that you and I both face, but India is leading the way in many of these respects. But it's also the conversations that they have with like-minded students, where they're actually in many respects, the takeaways are actually you and I are similar. Yes, we are far away. Yes, there are cultural nuances, but we're all students at the end of the day. We are very similar. There are some, I'm learning a whole lot about your culture that I want to learn more about. You can't learn everything in 2 weeks. I haven't learned everything in 12 years since we moved there in 2010. But it's almost the tip of the iceberg, but it leaves students asking the right questions rather than just sitting back and absorbing media perhaps that people are making their own interpretations about, right? So I would argue, and again, it's not those negative stereotypes. For example, when we went to Indian Solar Alliance with our students in January this year, our students were blown away about the leadership India is taking in the renewable energy sector, for example, something that people wouldn't necessarily know about. It might not just be renewables, it might be tech, it might be space. There's just so many sectors and interesting areas that India is taking great leadership on that your everyday Australian university student would not know about unless they are actively looking in the right places. So there's really no substitute in experiencing the right program in another country to engage and immerse yourself in that culture.
My final question, Sean, and thanks very much for your time. I want to ask you, I have very fond memories of you in India. What is the one thing that you miss most about your time or from your time in India? I know you return often, teach at Sonipat at the Jindal University, but from your time living in Delhi, with your family, what is the one thing that you miss the most?
Well, it's hard to go past home cooked Bengali food at the Sengupta's household. I would say that.
You're very welcome anytime you're back here, my friend. You're very welcome. We will have you over again as many times as you want.
Mm. No, look, there's so many things we do miss, and as you say, I've been back 4 times since September, so very frequently get to go and have a lot of my favorite food and meet yourself and other of my favorite people, and interacting often even with my students in Sonipat, who have that passion and that fire to you know make things better, build a stronger India in many respects. Of course, I teach a lot of aspiring budding lawyers, and it can be very inspiring, even working with and teaching that next generation. So that's something I always look forward to experiencing and doing when I'm back. No, I was just alluding to the fact that it's what's very interesting now is that there are more and more direct flights from different parts of Australia, from Sydney and Melbourne to Delhi to Bengaluru, and it's becoming easier for Australians like myself to go backwards and forwards to India and meet our extended networks, people who I consider my extended family over there in India on a more regular basis.
That's wonderful, Sean. The Star family is always very welcome back in India. Thanks very much for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindol.